Good afternoon. My name is Nat Malkus. I'm the Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm pleased to have you all here to join us for this discussion of the next conservative K-12 education agenda. Perhaps more than ever before, American schools are in a state of flux. Many schools are still figuring out how and some whether to reopen as the pandemic rages on. And while it might be tempting to want to return to normal once students are back in buildings, this moment provides what's hopefully a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rebuild and improve the education system. And conservatives are in a unique position to advocate for change, especially as they are relatively free from the confines of bureaucracies, the influence of teachers' unions, and the academia. So given all that, it's important for us to consider what principles should guide conservative thinking when it comes to K-12 education, and what policies conservatives should advocate for in the coming years to meet the needs of families and students. To discuss what those principles are and what policies should flow from them, we have a fantastic set of panelists. Joining me today is Lindsey Burke, who is the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Holly Kuzmich is the executive director of the George W. Bush Institute. And last but certainly not least, Ian Rowe is the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies and a resident fellow here at AEI. Today's run of show is very simple. I'm going to start peppering our panelists with questions about the next conservative education agenda. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and the last 15 minutes of today's event is reserved for questions from you, the audience. So if you have a question that you'd like our panelists to answer, feel free to submit them via email to Haley Sannon at haley.sannon@aei.org. Haley's email address is listed on the event page if you need to look it up. Or you can go onto Twitter and send us a question using the hashtag Conservative K-12 Ed Agenda. That's Conservative K-12 Ed Agenda. And with that, let's get into the conversation. Lindsey, I'd like to start off with you, but of course, I want all of our panelists to feel free to jump in on the conversation as they see fit. Lindsey, we're about just 4 weeks into the Biden administration, and we have seen some action on ed issues, but surely that's just early days, and there's plenty more to come. So to try and figure out what we're in store for, we could just look into a looking glass, or we might look back to the Obama administration, which of course was Vice President Biden's administration. So to start us off, what Obama administration era policies and priorities, what do those suggest that we can expect for K-12 education during the Biden administration?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Nat, and thanks for having me, and thanks to AEI's education team for inviting me today. Excited to be here to discuss possible conservative policy solutions moving forward, and to think a little bit back, your question about the Obama administration and what we might expect from a Biden administration. Yeah, I think there are three big things that, like Obama, we can expect: aggressive use of dear colleague letters and agency guidance. I would say, like Obama, a lot of new spending at the K-12 level, and like the Obama administration, hostility potentially toward private school choice. So I think on the first, on this idea of really sort of aggressive use of agency guidance and dear colleague letters, we've already seen the Biden administration engage in this pretty quickly. In January, President Biden issued an executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So already an EO there. This applies a broader application of last year's Supreme Court ruling and the Bostock decision, and calls for that Supreme Court ruling to apply to Title IX. And that's, of course, the federal law that prohibits discrimination in federally funded schools. So this could impact school restrooms and locker rooms and school sports. So that was right out of the gate. President Biden also signed another executive order on January 20th that extended the pause on student loan repayments and interest through September. And he's already signed an EO terminating the Trump administration's 1776 commission. So I don't think that that is the end of executive orders or regulatory guidance. If the Obama years are any indication of the Biden years, I think we could see an attempt to reinstate Obama-era school discipline policy through Dear Colleague letters, basically applying a disparate impact standard to school discipline issues. I think we could see a reversal of Secretary DeVos's Title IX guidance that restored due process on college campuses for students accused of sexual assault. So there's a lot we could see there. On the new spending, very much like we saw with the Obama years, we're already seeing a lot of new spending from Washington. The COVID spending package that is currently under consideration in Congress would send another $130 billion to elementary and secondary schools. And if you look at what they're also proposing in the higher ed space, that totals $170 billion on education just in this third stimulus package. So if you add that spending to the two prior COVID spending bills that were enacted last year, that would mean an additional $282 billion for education. That's nearly 4 times the Department of Education's annual $72 billion discretionary budget. So it's really a breathtaking sum that, by the way, I would say is going to reward a lot of school districts that are still refusing to open their doors to students. And then finally, on the last point, like Obama, unfortunately, I think we could see hostility toward private school choice options. I think less hostility, hopefully, toward the charter school sector. But you'll recall during the Obama years, every single budget cycle, the Obama administration tried to zero out funding for the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, the only federally funded school voucher program, appropriately so, because it's in Washington, DC, helping low-income children in the nation's capital. And yet, every single year, we had to fight to keep this very modest program intact. Unfortunately, I anticipate we could see more of that moving forward.
Wow, that was a super comprehensive answer, Lindsey. I'm not sure that Ian, you left enough fruit on the vine for Ian and Holly to comment on, but I want to leave them an opening if they have something to weigh in.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with the assessment, and I think you were more optimistic on the opposition to the charter school front. He literally was on record saying, because he tied DeVos and Trump to charter schools, that that era may come to an end. So I think we all have to be vigilant to ensure that we preserve this very fundamental idea that every parent, regardless of income level, race, geography, has the power to choose a great school for their child. And what's equally sort of frustrating is that he's grounded everything in this idea of equity. And by all accounts, a definition of equity is defined actually by its opposite, inequity. So wherever inequity exists, that disparate outcome must be due to some structurally racist or some other structural bias. And so if equity is always the answer, it's not clear how that correlates with, how about this, excellence for every kid and the opportunity to achieve at the highest level. So, his initial moves have been concerning. I mean, despite the large amounts of money, it's not yet clear how things like school choice, which is so fundamental to so many low-income kids across the country, how they're going to continue to have that option.
Nat, I'll just add quickly, in addition to some of the kind of guidance and regulatory issues, which is the way we suspect the Biden administration is going to go about their business and spending, which is, this has always been a divide between Democrats and Republicans, right, in terms of how they use authority at the federal level. It's going to be interesting to see from a policy perspective how this plays out, because watching Joe Biden, when he was in the Senate, et cetera, he was always a little, when you think about the Obama administration and some of what they did, many people think he's going to be a little bit further to the left. And I mean, even with what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, with it being such a strange time with COVID, where that's sort of the front and center issue in school right now, the moves they've made, in lockstep with the unions are not great signals that we're seeing so far. So we're not knee deep in sort of the traditional policy issues that the federal government and the U.S. Department of Education normally are engaged in. Those will come in time, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
So there's a number of concerns, and I want to move on to another issue in a moment, but I'll just ask, there's some things that I think that we could say, well, Joe Biden has moved in a way that is better than he certainly could have done. So he's shown some leadership on trying to get schools reopened. And he's also pushed back on some of the most sort of exorbitant debt forgiveness plans that were bandied about during the campaign. At what points do we think he deserves some credit?
To be determined, I think, right? Like, I think he did. The way he talked about reopening schools on the campaign trail, I generally liked. Now, watching what's played out over the past couple of weeks has not been heartening, and it's even been interesting to see his answer last night in the town hall as to how he sort of pushed back on some of the okay, 1 day a week at school things that have been said. I mean, he gets a lot of pressure, and so we'll see. But
it's a little hard to answer right now. I mean, I will say there was a time where I think many of us were fearful that the person he was going to name to be the Secretary of Education was Randy Weingarten or a very senior union leader, and that would have certainly sent a signal. So by choosing Cardona, who seems to be a bit more moderate, that seemed to be a step in the right direction. What's now unclear, though, is how powerful Cardona will actually be, because it certainly seems that the teachers' unions are having a significant influence.
Yeah, Ian, I want to ask you a question about your perspective on conservative principles and policies that should be prioritized by conservative, and particularly as a school founder, and in your work on the curriculum front with the group 1776 Unites, which I want to make clear is distinct, although similarly named, to former President Trump's 1776 Commission. But from those perspectives, I mean, what are the principles and policies that conservatives should be arguing for?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I mean, for the last decade, I ran a network of public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan, 2,000 kids, mostly low income, mostly Black and Hispanic kids. And one of the most important things you want to impart to young people, especially in low income communities, is this idea that they've got a shot at the American dream, that they live in a good, if not great, country that certainly has had its issues with discrimination and oppression, and that it's really important that they learn the full history, warts and all, so that they can understand what have been the pathways that kids like them have followed to move from persecution to prosperity. And over the last really couple of years, there's been, particularly in curricula, there's been a movement to sort of cherry pick history. So whether it's the Black Lives Matter curriculum or the 1619 project that's been launched by the New York Times, these are movements that are trying to paint the United States as an irredeemably racist country, that the founding ideals were false when they were written, that the country is not a democracy, it was founded as a slaveocracy. When young people hear those kinds of messages over and over and over and over again, you start to believe that you don't have a shot at the American dream. And the unfortunate thing is, there's enough negative history in the United States. If you want to compile a story and paint it so that you're a Black kid or you're a poor kid, you can create that narrative, but it's not the true narrative. So I think generally, and this cuts both ways. I mean, on January 6th, we had this terrible event in Congress, and imagine you had the President of the United States saying, no, the Vice President can overturn the election, right? So there's some group of people that believe that that's something that was possible. And on the other side, the 1619 project, you've got kids who might be learning that this country is hostile to their dreams. So there is a very, very important, I don't think it's just a conservative priority, it's all Americans. Civic knowledge of a full understanding of our country is something that's very important, which is why I joined with a number of other Black leaders to form 1776 Unites. to say that the founding ideals of the country, faith, family, hard work, entrepreneurship, these things matter and they're accessible to everyone. And so it's just very important to have a counterbalance, not to cancel 1619 Project or other things, but to say that there's actually a very compelling counterargument for what this country was built on. And I think kids need to get access to that full story.
Yeah, I really like how you've couched this in terms of the message that we send to students about their own agency in their lives. I think that there's I don't think that's just a conservative principle, but I think that certainly conservatives should push actively to make sure that freedom is in full flower, not in spite of someone's agency, but because of the agency. But I'm curious, both Ian and Holly and Lindsey, part of what, Ian, you're talking about is our need to sort of right size or get us moving in the right direction on civic education. Just from a sort of brass tacks perspective, how are we doing right now in those regards? Aside from just saying, well, we need to avoid extremes on the left or the right, how are we doing just on actually instilling and teaching students the basic building blocks of civic participation and virtue?
Well, if you look at the metric by which we answer that question, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the nation's report card, the last assessment that was done on the understanding of US history, I think the number is 15% of 8th graders and 12th graders have even a basic understanding of American history, chronology, how government works. So we're doing really poorly. And again, I think that lack of understanding actually helps to contribute to what we saw on January 6th. I mean, and the other thing is in New York State, where I am, back in 2010, for a whole bunch of reasons, they eliminated the requirement for there to be an annual history exam. And what's happened over the last 12 years, you literally could see the school schedule, especially in elementary school, where you used to have 5 days a week, social studies, 45 minutes per day. You can literally track the data and see how schools have essentially just eliminated that. So now you've got maybe 1 or 2 days, 40 minutes per day of actual history and social studies filled up by other ELA related tasks like understanding the main idea, these tasks that don't actually help build knowledge. So I think there's also an effort to how do you resurrect actual, high quality history standards. And I know there's an effort now called Educating for American Democracy that's going to be launching soon that's going to try to attempt to answer that question.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of things to that. So what Ian said is, of course, absolutely right. Pushing back against 1619, this idea that our founding ideals were false when they were written is critically important, no pun intended, because critical theory, I think broadly, is the other issue that we really do need to push back against in schools. I mean, these ideas that are seeping into the K-12 system now, like intersectionality, kids learning to group people into groups of oppressors versus oppressed. I mean, this stuff is trickling down from the colleges of education and making its way into the K-12 system right now. And then this broader effort toward action civics and away from genuine civic instruction, teaching children to really protest before they know what they're protesting about, is something else that should concern everybody. And there are policy levers that we have and that state policymakers should use in order to restore genuine civics education. Things like curriculum transparency. And that sounds simple, and it sounds almost obvious, as if parents currently have access to information about what's taught in their children's schools. But for a lot of parents, they don't. School districts can make it very difficult for parents, for taxpayers to access this material. My colleague, Jonathan Butcher, has been working on this in conjunction with the Goldwater Institute. But they point out, policies exist today that require parents to physically visit a school district to see the school's reading list, or they will limit the time of day during which parents can access the materials that are being used. And those are obstacles to civic engagement. And this is, look, if there are a couple of silver linings, I think, in the K-12 space from the pandemic, I think this is maybe one of them, in addition to education choice, hopefully proliferating broadly, is that parents have had a seat inside their children's classroom, their virtual classroom, for the past year, and they've had an opportunity to review what's taking place in that virtual classroom. They should have that opportunity all the time, every single day, as soon as they want it, and should be able to see what their children are being taught in school.
Yeah, I wonder. We live in a particular time where polarization is nothing to underestimate. And so if we have a challenge on civics for an education system, and I think that you can make a pretty strong case that we have a very clear challenge. What advice should we give, and what should conservatives think about pursuing a civics engagement, teaching civic virtue, making sure kids understand the basic building blocks of our democracy and our society that works away from polarization? Obviously, the setup that we've talked about can sort of sound like, oh, we're working towards one end where there's this other group working towards the other, but that seems like it could be a problematic solution. So in the age of polarization, what's the call for educators and schools?
Well, I would, Nat, I would actually say, in some ways, I think the call, as I often think about sort of where the levers are, and I know we might talk about this a little bit. I do think we have to have some worry about these curricular issues and sort of, what are we teaching? But I also just think for an issue like civics, and I'm going to say the same thing for reading and math and sort of the fundamentals, we just need more of it. And we especially need more of it for certain kids. I mean, Ian referenced the NAEP results for last year on history. Like, we're just not doing a good enough job on history. We're not doing a good enough job on reading, and we're not doing a good enough job on math. Like these core subjects, and the levers are really at the state level. So, so I think that, and some states have actually started to move the needle on this. I mean, states like Florida over the past several years have done some interesting things on civics education. And so part of it's like really understanding what states have done some interesting things and how do we really advance that in other places around the country, because I think much of this action should actually be happening there.
And one thing I'd say in defense of the 1619 project is that you can say the one thing it's unearthed is that there is a yearning for curricula that helps to tell the story of the African-American experience in the United States. I mean, I've listened to a number of webinars now of teachers who are adopting the 1619 project curricula, and these are in some of the worst performing districts in the country. And so they're saying that we want more stories. So the reason why 1776 Unites came together was not only just to write essays and to talk about the founding ideals, it was also to create a curricula that is an empowering alternative. So I think part of it is to show that there is a choice that is not mired in historic oppression, that tells authentic stories that we're hoping can resonate with all Americans. So I think creating compelling alternatives, that's one thing. The second thing that I would not do is what is happening in a lot of school districts across the country, which is that when it comes to professional development and anti-bias training, we've got teachers being separated by race. We've got white teachers have to go into classrooms. They have to, declare their oppression. They have to confess their unearned privilege. And there's almost zero evidence that any of these kind of anti-bias trainings are actually resulting in improved outcomes for kids or better relations amongst faculty. So I think we have to be really cautious about dividing up our very teachers, the ones who we want to model cohesiveness, strong unions, strong partnerships, and separating folks in this sort of racial reductionism where if you're white, you're an oppressor. If you're not white, you're oppressed. That's not going to get us to where we want to go.
Well, Holly, let me ask, I want to pitch a question to you. As a bit of context, many of our listeners will know this, but it's important to point out the federal government in non-COVID years, Lindsey, is responsible for about 10% of K-12 funding nationwide. And that varies a little bit, but by and large, state and local governments are picking up the vast majority of the tab. Given that, Holly, what are the levers that the federal government has available that they can use effectively and that they should use? And how does the answers to those questions inform the policies that conservatives should prioritize?
So obviously, I think there's a couple different ways to think about this. Number one is funding, sort of where is funding being driven, because obviously there is a role for, there's a role to sort of set the right level of policy in relationship to the money that is being appropriated to states and then down through districts. So, you look at the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and that's the significant area of investment in K through 12. And there are some levers to be pulled there, right? In terms of how the federal government, what its relationship looks like to states. And then you really need to let the states sort of manage that relationship down to the district level. But two things that I would say that can be used, they're not always used well. And you also have to be careful how you use them. You can, and I'll add a third, which you need to be careful of. The federal government can do some innovating well. They can set up, I think about my time at the U.S. Department of Education, and one of the programs we had then was the Teacher Incentive Fund, and it started to create some incentives for states and districts to really look at how to pay teachers based on their performance and put them in the highest need schools. And that created some momentum at the district and state level. Now, that wasn't the role for the feds to be funding that and creating that in perpetuity, and you always have to be cautious of that. But I do think there can be a role for the feds to sort of find and pilot innovations in interesting areas and look at things that could be scaled. I think the other thing that we shouldn't underestimate is just what I would call the use of the bully pulpit and the convening ability of the federal government. Now, this can be used for good, and it can sometimes be used for not good. But as I've been thinking about COVID and watching what's been happening over the past year, I think sort of room for opportunity that I haven't fully seen seized is, the feds, not just the government, but just in their ability to bring together smart people from across the country. As we've thought about reopening K through 12 schools, we've gotten this guidance from the CDC. But this is about so much more than that, right? Like, how do you think about safety? How do you think about design of school buildings? How do you think about what gets put in place at the local level? We have not the federal government could have done a better job at bringing together non-governmental entities to say, how do we do this in a smart way? And what kind of guidance and best practices can we put out there? Because they do have a bully pulpit. And I think that is an area that sometimes people get real focused on what's our legislative and executive authority, what authority has Congress given us? And you do have to be careful here, but it also can be used to sort of spur some interesting discussions around issues that might be a little bit farther off into the future too. And that was one of the things I actually wrote about in a piece for AEI, was also just rethinking the school day and the school year, where there could be some interesting sort of convening power to think about that topic without the federal government having a real role in that, but sort of spurring discussion that could bring some innovation to the field.
So one of the spaces that I talked briefly about in the introduction that I want to flesh out here with all three of you, but Holly, I'll ask you to kick it off first. There's been a pandemic. It's made some serious changes to our education system, mostly challenges. but I wonder what you believe COVID has unearthed about education that feeds into priorities for reform moving forward.
Yep, a couple things. Number one, it's exacerbated what we already know, which is that there is a significant achievement gap, and that we have kind of this one-size-fits-all model that doesn't necessarily work. I mean, we've seen higher income kids who, in many cases, are sometimes doing better at home than they are in school, and we've seen low-income kids who often are doing worse by not being in school. So it's sort of laid bare this achievement gap that we have always known is there. I think it really points out that we've got to get better about being creative about how we use technology. I mean, one of my hopes is that we could come up with more interesting staffing models instead of just having a teacher and 25 kids in the classroom, that you've got some kids working online, going at different paces. And that we're thinking a little bit more creatively about how we use teachers in the classroom with kids. I think there's some real room for innovation there.
Ian, Lindsey, anything that you see as potential areas for innovation or change that sort of flow from the pandemic?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first obvious point is that it continues to accentuate the need for school choice. I mean, more parents are now getting a direct view of what their kids are actually learning, and in all cases, they're not so happy. So the idea of giving parents more ability to choose their school is fundamental. But in terms of the innovation, I was part of a team, we created something called the National Summer School Initiative last summer. And it was pretty amazing. We ended up educating 12,000 kids in 17 states. And Holly, to your point, the key innovation was that we hired 14 mentor teachers who are some of the best teachers in the country. And anyone who's run a school like me knows that, in a particular grade, you might have that incredible teacher, in fourth grade for those 25 students. And the other two fourth grade teachers, maybe not as great. And there's always the question of how do you leverage that top talent? And what we were able to do was to essentially take that top fourth grade teacher. They had their own class, their own virtual classroom, videotaped it. So they were essentially a day ahead of the other teachers within the same grade and same subject. And on a daily basis, that mentor teacher with the video of the lesson that they've just taught would have a virtual PD session with all of the other teachers in that same grade and subject for the class that those other teachers are going to be teaching the next day. So it was the most incredible intellectual preparation that teachers had ever had. And they were now part of a larger professional learning community with other teachers who were doing the same exact work. So that's the kind of innovation that I think hopefully will survive, because you can do that same thing even in a in-person environment. So yeah, it isn't all doom and gloom. So anyway, that's an example of I think a very innovative thing that we were able to push out last summer, and we'll be doing again this summer.
I love that, Ian. That's so interesting. And it's ground up, it's school level innovation. It's fascinating and such a great model. And, I think, of course, if we're all sitting here thinking about, where does innovation come from and can it come from Washington? I think the answer is no. We have enough evidence now over decades, over a century to really know that innovation is going to come from things like Ian just mentioned, from ground up teachers and school leaders working in a way that really works for them and works for their students. There are some things that Washington can do to help sort of pave the way for innovation at the state level. I would say first, they need to allow states to opt out of the myriad programs and regulations that currently exist at the federal level and be allowed to put their existing emphasis on the existing federal education dollars toward any lawful education purpose under state law, give state leaders, local leaders flexibility with how and where to spend their money. And then in DC proper, I mentioned the DC voucher program earlier. That is something Washington it should be doing and should expand and support. I know that is expansion's probably far-fetched at the moment under the current administration, but at least be supportive of the existing program. Those students and families are doing so well with their ability in DC to select into learning environments that are the right fit for them. So really, I mean, in my mind, in the K-12 realm, that's it for Washington. Give states flexibility and foster the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. And then at that point, we're going to see a lot of innovation flourish. And again, you know, there aren't many silver linings from the pandemic, but the second silver lining, I think, is the fact that we're seeing so much choice and individualized learning start to expand across the country. We're seeing things like pandemic pods proliferate. This is, you know, civil society in action. It was just amazing to see immediately after the pandemic, families pull together, they pulled resources, they gathered kids in the neighborhood together, they hired, you know, teachers to come in and teach the students and co-quarantine. And it was just a beautiful illustration of what families can do working together to design education options that work for their children. So hopefully we will see that really not only stick around, but even take hold a little bit more. Right now, if you look at the states, there are 22 states that have active proposals in place in their state legislatures to provide or expand school choice options for kids. So hopefully we'll see much more of that. And then I also think that there's room for innovation around how we assess student learning, and not only room for innovation, but we're going to have some necessary conversations moving forward about what assessment looks like in the future post-pandemic.
Well, let's talk about that post-pandemic. We've talked about some of the silver linings from the pandemic. Perhaps more obvious is the ominous gray color of the clouds with those linings. And, you know, conservatives need an answer to what should we do about learning loss? What is it that we need to be prepared to do and to help? What principles should we base those responses on, and what policies should be pursued? Especially when, as Holly, I believe you were talking about, some students have really taken it on the chin, and other students have found ways or been blessed with ways where they can avoid some of the worst results. Ian, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to kick that off.
Well, the first thing I'd say, you know, rather than just, as we all do, pontificate about what the learning loss has been, I think we've got to resolve the logistical challenges and have state testing this year. Because if state tests are foregone as they were a year ago, that means we will have 2 years, we will be of non-testing, we will be operating blindly to even know what kids have learned or not, or how far they've fallen behind. So for me, I think a lot of states are just throwing up their hands to say, we can't handle logistical challenges. To me, it's a complete abdication of responsibility. We need state testing, and we need testing that allows comparability to what occurred in the last testing in 2019. Because again, otherwise, there will be no basis upon which to even know how we should move forward with whatever interventions we decide to do.
Holly, Lindsey?
Yeah, well, let me say, I wholeheartedly agree with Ian on this issue of testing. Now we can talk about, you know, what does accountability look like on the back end of testing, but do the tests need to occur, and are states going to have to get somewhat creative? Yes. And does that mean some kids might, some segment of kids might not be able to take the test because of the challenges of test security and in person, et cetera? Yes, but I still think the test needs to occur. Otherwise, we have 2 years with just little to no information about how we're doing there.
And I would just add, parents really need information about where their kids are, particularly, you know, in the midst of a pandemic. And so we can be innovative about the ways we think about testing as well. I had a piece for AEI on this about freeing up money so that parents can actually use what would look more like an appraisal market for student assessment. So if you think about how, for example, an education savings account works, where you get the money that would have been spent on your child in a public school, and then you can use those dollars for private school tuition, but also private tutors and online learning and testing. We want dollars to look much more like that, where parents could access either through something like an ESA, or even if their child stays in the public system, be able to tap into a portion of the per pupil dollars that are spent on their child in the public school, leverage that, go to outside testing companies or other organizations that can assess student learning and be able to pay them directly to get a sense of where your child is in terms of their learning gains or learning loss. And again, coupling that, the assessment portion is important, but I think more important than anything, and what we've learned or had driven home more than anything over the past 12 months, is that we have to make our education funding more nimble. There is not a lack of funding right now. There is a lot of money broadly in the system, but that money flows to a system. We've got to shift toward funding students rather than systems and allowing dollars to follow kids to whatever learning option is the right fit for them.
So let me pause and just let the audience remember that we've got just about 5 more minutes left while I'm going to hog the questioning, and then I'm going to turn it over to you for questions. So again, you can email questions to Haley, and again, it's on the page, the landing page, her email, or you can tweet them. And when I look at the hashtag again, it's hashtag conservative K-12 ed agenda. That's conservative K-12 ed agenda. Before we move on, I want to ask some specific questions about school choice. The change in administration certainly changes the White House's perspective on private school choice and school choice, generally speaking. But zooming out, I'm sort of puzzled. And Lindsey, I know you've heard me talk about this before. On some instances, you can see that school choice really has some headwinds right now, right? There's lots of people that have experienced a lot of things. They may feel frustration with schools. They may have been looking for other options. Some private schools have had increased enrollments, et cetera, et cetera. Those seem to be headwinds, or tailwinds rather. There may also be some headwinds, right? I mean, a lot of people miss their schools. They really want schools to be back open, and I'm assuming that schools will reopen so that eventually when parents return, they may just be feeling like, wow, I'm so glad for these schools to be open. It's such a relief that I don't need school choice. I'm happy with what I've got. So what perspective do you think is sort of going to carry the day in terms of public opinion? And how is it that you think conservatives should be looking at the way public opinion is going to change or shift on school choice after the pandemic?
Yeah, so we're already seeing a positive bump in support for education choice options in the polling. If you look at polling from EdChoice, for example, we see significant increases in the proportion of respondents who have positive views toward school choice. And by school choice, they're questioning everything from tax credit scholarships to vouchers to education savings accounts. Their ESA number, if I'm not mistaken, was 85% positive this year, as in 85% of respondents said they like the idea of an education savings account. So I think that's partly a reflection of the fact that families are getting a taste of education choice and customization broadly. Back in March of last year now, it's been almost a year that we've been in this situation. Every family with a school-age child became an accidental homeschooler, and that was tough to navigate. And families were having to navigate crisis online learning provided by school districts. And so that was a struggle and remains a struggle for a lot of families. But as somebody alluded to earlier, for many more families, they're also really, I think, experiencing a level of flexibility with their child's education that they haven't had before. And so I think that is reflected in that 85% number. And we're also seeing, I think, evidence that homeschooling is going to see a long-term permanent uptick in homeschooling enrollment. We were at about 3% of the school-age population pre-pandemic. Evidence suggests that will double, could even go as high as 10% moving forward. So I think a lot more flexibility within the system, which I would argue is a very good thing indeed. Several people have made the joke that the teachers unions have done more for school choice this year than Milton Friedman. I think that there's a little bit of truth in that statement.
Ian, Holly, anything to add?
Yeah, now I just want to, when you raised this question, you said, we can generally potentially see more support for school choice, but then we also see this feeling that people miss their schools. I think it's important to remember both are true, right? And they don't need to be opposing sort of viewpoints, that we actually should embrace both of them. And I think that's actually what's good for conservatives, is to remember that having viable private school choice options is important, but making sure that we have really good, viable options, public charter schools is important as well. And that so many parents actually, they need to make the choice that's best for them. In many cases, that is their local public school down the street from them. And in some cases, it's a private school. So we have to, we sometimes let the other side sort of make it be a choice. And I don't think they need to be a choice. And I think we should be embracing all of it, number one. And I also think what the pandemic has showed us is that school is also just an important community asset. And for so many working families, especially, it's childcare, right? Like, as they're off at a job, schools are what take care of their kids. So we also need to just keep that in mind, no matter whether that's public charter, or private. Sort of the value of schools to the community is something for us to really keep in mind. And conservatives generally are about the kids and the families, and we need to keep that mind front and center in terms of how we orient our policy going forward.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's neither conservative nor liberal or anywhere on the political spectrum. I think we all agree that it's really hurting most kids not to be able to go to their physical school. And so it is unfathomable to me that the CDC came out with guidelines that didn't make it explicit that teachers should be vaccinated. I mean, the teachers unions, for a number of reasons, are saying that they don't want to be back in schools, and sometimes it's a legitimate concern. Why wouldn't teachers be prioritized at the same level as healthcare workers and the elderly? Teachers are essential. And so if we really want to get kids back in school, so we can start to address the learning loss, all of the issues we're concerned about, let's vaccinate teachers. And it's mind-boggling to me that we can't figure out a way to prioritize. Unfortunately, currently the vaccines are a zero-sum game. So we have to decide who needs to get the vaccine. And to me, educators, faculty need to be prioritized. And that would be an area that unions, conservatives, everyone, I think, could get behind.
And of course, the unions are shifting the goalposts on that point too, Ian, right? They have said, well, we'll reopen school, we'll bless school reopening when we know it's safe. And we now know that from all the evidence. And then they said, well, once teachers are vaccinated, so teachers got moved up on the prioritization schedule. I'm here in Northern Virginia, that's the case here. And they said, well, now we want to wait until children are vaccinated. And there's not even an approved COVID vaccine yet for children under the age of 16. So for some of these special interest groups, they're effectively saying keep schools closed indefinitely, which is beyond unacceptable.
I hear you. And unfortunately, we are in this political environment, but in my view, we got to call them on it, because if we believe the science, then the efficacy rates of the vaccines for adults are extremely high. We also know that the data of kids being super spreader is infinitesimal. So those two things, high vaccination rates amongst teachers, low infection rates amongst kids, from a public messaging perspective, that would seem to create the conditions to make more people comfortable to get schools open, which should be our priority right now.
So I promised that I would turn it over to questions from the audience, and I'm a little bit behind. So I'm going to supercharge these and ask you to get punchy and right to the point. I also want to make room for all of you to respond. We're talking about unions. I've been given one on unions, so I'm going to read it verbatim. We've seen unions work to keep schools closed. Superintendents, school boards, and state chiefs of education and governors can't reopen schools when unions won't. What policies can we support to correct this outrageous imbalance of power, which represents such a threat to the education of our children? So how do we deal with unions that are resisting going back? Ian.
Vaccinate teachers and couple that with the evidence that kids are not super spreaders, have public messaging campaigns, and have bold leadership. We have to make choices. If schools are open, let's ensure teachers do not have a legitimate reason to not go into their school buildings and leverage the science.
And if the unions continue to stand in the way, right, even after everything Ian said, if they're still, blocking the way to school reopening, then states and districts need to get a little more, I guess, harsh in their pushback against these special interest groups, because we're in a new situation now, where before, 4 or 5, 6 months ago, it was school districts who were keeping their doors closed. But now a lot of these districts are trying to reopen. Chicago, right? Philadelphia, they're trying to reopen, and the unions are blocking their ability to do that. If that's the case, then these districts and states should say, you know what, if you are a striking teachers union, or what looks an awful lot like a strike, and you are preventing your teachers from going to work, you're preventing families from accessing in-person instruction, and you're going against what the district says they want to do, which is to reopen, then we're going to take your striking salary of your education employees, we're going to send it back to the state, and we're going to give it to kids in the form of an ESA or other education choice measure.
Yeah, be loud about it. You just have to call it out. Like, the mayor of Chicago got very visibly and vocally frustrated at this, and she started calling it out.
Yeah, and I'll just add to this. I've been working on a project to track school district closures across the nation, and that's going to come out soon. But part of what we've been looking at is how this varies by the vote in this past presidential election. And just to put on here, the districts that are closed are overwhelmingly went for Biden in the administration. And this is perhaps no surprise to most folks that a lot of Trump districts are already open, or at least proportionally far more are. And that does suggest, to the leadership point of view, especially at the bully pulpit, that it could be effective, because the folks most likely to take leadership from the president they voted for on this issue are also the folks that tend to be closed. So I'm going to go to another question. Thank you for being fairly quickly on that one. On the 1619 project, again, I'll read it verbatim. Do we have any evidence about how widespread changes in public school civics and government's instruction or curricula have been in the past few years? In particular, I'm wondering whether anyone on the panel is aware of ongoing efforts to catalog how many states or districts have adopted the 1619 project in their curricula. So panel, what do we know about the progress of 1619 in particular, and whether there's been any pushback that's effective to it?
It's a good question, because it is hard to measure. I mean, the Pulitzer Center, that is the partner for the 1619 project distribution of the curriculum, on their website, I think they've said they've had 4,000 downloads. Now, the 1776 Unites curriculum, which is right now only at the high school level, we just crossed 7,000 downloads, almost all educators in all 50 states. So we're excited by that. But it's really hard, because, as you know, Nat, again, anyone who runs schools, at the end of the day, a teacher can close their door and teach what they want to teach. So again, for me, it's not necessarily always bashing 1619, although again, there's some real issues with that curriculum. It's creating a compelling alternative that more and more faculty say, wow, that's exciting. I want to bring that to my kids, to have them see the history of the country, warts and all, and still walk away with the idea that this is a good, if not great, country.
So following on that, I'm going to skip unless you jump in. So you got to jump in quick, panelists. I have a question, and Ian, this is right in your wheelhouse, since you've been talking about agency. To what extent do conservatives, when they're talking about education reform, need to stress the importance of intact families? And what, if any, policy levers are available for such a vexing problem? Ian, I've talked with you about this many times, so I'm gonna offer it to you first.
Well, I spend a lot of time thinking about the role of the stability and structure of families, and I actually don't think it needs to be a conservative issue. I mean, the data is overwhelming that kids who are raised in married two-parent households do better on a wide range of outcomes. That is just fact-based. And so as we're educating the next generation about the series of decisions that they're going to be making in their life, there's just overwhelming data. If you finish your education, even just a high school degree, full-time job of any kind, just you learn the dignity and discipline of work. And if you have children, marriage first, millennials who follow that series of decisions, 97% avoid poverty. That's a powerful, powerful set of outcomes that kids should at least know, not as a prescription, but as a description of the kinds of choices that will exist in their control that are related to family stability and much more likely economically positive outcomes for themselves, their spouse, and their children. And so this is not to demonize single mothers or all the variations of families that do exist in our society, but the data is overwhelming that family stability, family structure matters a lot. And so as we educate young people about the decisions that they're going to make, as they make their own passage into young adulthood, they deserve to know that information.
And this is something that parents want and school board members largely want to have their schools teach as well. We recently conducted a nationally representative survey. We hired an outside firm to do it. And we asked about the success sequence specifically. And in the question, we basically explained it as quickly as possible, right? You graduate high school, you get a job, and you get married before having children. And then we ask parents, again, nationally representative across the country, do you believe your child's school should teach the success sequence? And 72% said yes, that they want their school to teach the success sequence. These are public schools. And then if school board members, same question we posed to the school board members, 60% of school board members said, yes, they want their schools teaching this explicitly. So I think there's a big appetite for it right now, and schools should embrace teaching it.
So I'm going to flip this just a little bit, because I do think there can be a little bit of a danger in some of how we talk about this. And one of the things, and this goes to the piece I wrote for you all at AI, one of the things that I also think we have to recognize, though, and I think we haven't really talked about this very much in education, is that our school model right now is not built for the needs of families today. Moms are working, dads are working. We have a lot of single parents. And as I mentioned, school is childcare. And I do think we have to acknowledge that the way we think about school, you show up at 8 o'clock and end at 3, does not fit the needs of working families. So it's a little bit of a different point than what we were just talking about in terms of what ultimately makes you successful in life and what does the data say. But I do think we have to recognize, and this isn't a liberal or conservative piece, but the way we've organized the system, no matter whether it's public, private, or charter, is not necessarily great for families today who have to piece together, what do we do after school? How do we put together enrichment activities for kids? It's a lot easier for higher income families than lower income families. So I think it'd be interesting to have a conversation around that issue and get a little creative there.
Yeah, I think you've floated a great topic for the next conservative K-12 education webinar, and that is, how do you have pro-family education policies and balance those with an appropriate role for schools? But I certainly take your point. We have just a few more minutes, and I'm going to go back to the many questions. You can keep submitting them, although I think that if you haven't submitted yet, it's going to be hard to fit yours in. This one's on digital learning innovation. Again, these are well-written questions, so I'm going to just take it verbatim. Because of the explosion in digital learning during the pandemic, what innovative things could forward-thinking districts who want to improve upon providing an array of quality digital learning platforms and courses do next?
Well, I offered up the example of what we did last summer, and again, we'll do this summer, but the idea of leveraging your top talent, your master teachers, there's a real opportunity to do that. You can capture digitally the instruction, how they prepare for their lessons. Other teachers can see the kind of moves that expert teachers do, and engage in a real-time professional development. That's the kind of thing that just hasn't really taken place. And I do hope that is one area of innovation. And again, this idea of teachers now can become part of a larger professional learning community of other teachers in the same grade and the same subject, all sort of following a generally similar scope and sequence. And then you're sharing all sorts of unbelievably quality information. You're looking at student work. So that to me is one huge opportunity. But let's not believe that everything has to be digital. We still need kids in school with a human being teaching them.
Hear, hear. That is something that conservatives and everyone across the political spectrum, I think, can get behind, Ian, especially this year. So we have 1 minute left, and I'm just going, I can't throw out a question because we'll definitely go over time. So I'm going to thank Lindsey Burke, Holly Kuzmich, and Ian Rowe for being on our panel today. You guys were fantastic. I want to thank all our audience. Thank you for attending today's web event on the next conservative K-12 education agenda. I hope you'll join us in a couple of weeks for the next event in this series. On March 3rd at 4 p.m., we'll have the next conservative higher education agenda, and that will be every bit as high quality as this one was. So thanks to our listeners and our panelists. Have a great day.
Thank you.